Welcome to the Colorist Podcast. I'm doing a special episode here with an old friend of mine, Jason Myres, who you may know from Lift Gamma Gain and the posts that he puts up there. And he also did this little podcast with me before called the Coloristos. And Jason and I were talking, and we decided there's so many ideas for this 2018 NAB that I wanted to get him on the show so we could just have a little discussion about everything that had happened and break it all down. So here's Jason Myres.
Hey, how's it going? It's nice to be back on air with you, man.
Yeah, it's great to have you on too. I'd like to say it's been a long time. We still have kept in touch through the years, but we haven't been on a podcast together for a while.
No,
so.
it's been quite a while, hasn't it? Yeah.
So many people may have remembered the Coloristos, and those episodes are still up. Really, for like the last 8 years, Black magic has been dominating the conversations at NAB, and this one was no different, right? We'd been talking about this before too, but what is your take on the announcements from NAB with Black magic?
I think, in the end, if we didn't have Black magic, NAB would be, way less exciting. We'd have a lot of lectures on telemetry and broadcast stuff that would be, based around, signals to satellites and stuff like that. So, if you're into color, basically Black magic provides a huge portion of the incentive to go to NAB. And every year, what's really wild is it's sort of the question is, can they do it again? And they consistently, I think, for 5 or 6 years now, have come up with probably what have been showstoppers. So now Resolve 15. So
obviously, one of the biggest things that has come out of it is the introduction of fusion inside of Resolve. How do you think that that's going to change things?
Well, there's an interesting angle because I think we've had discussions about this stuff in the past where a lot of people have made the argument for a suite of tools versus the super tool. I think what's wild is when we all first saw Resolve, and I got my start in Final Cut 7, and then the next good color tool that I worked in was Resolve 8. And so when I first look at, my time in Resolve 8 back, 2010 or 11, the idea that you'd be able to do compositing and audio and what we'll call formidable editing in this focused color corrector is kind of amazing. So essentially what they've done is they've snuck up on us in creating a super tool because there are all sorts of apps in the past. I mean, Apple had one that was supposed to be a successor to Final Cut that was going to include like motion, like
Final Cut Extreme.
Yeah, or Phenomenon, I think it was called.
Right.
And, it was going to have all these things from Shake in it, and it was going to be really amazing. And then there was this big effort actually on Autodesk part with Smoke on Mac for 2013. People had great hopes for that. There was this idea for this all-in-one application. And actually all of those sort of either never were released or did not come to fruition the way people hoped. And Black magic never really mentioned much about a goal to make a super tool, but all of a sudden here we now have it, and it's staring us in the face, and it's free to use and download.
I mean, the thing is within the last few years, I always point to films like Mad Max, where he did a ton of sky replacements in Baselight, and over the last few years, we've been called upon to do more and more in color, right? So it kind of makes sense that that's all built in, but then there's also resistance because people say, well, it's taking away from the time that I'm doing color.
Yeah, I think one of the big questions a lot of colorists have is if the tool is capable of it, should I be capable of it? And so I think one of the things that Resolve, especially now that it has very complete editorial tool set, compositing, last year was audio, there's this thought that if you have Resolve, there's a good chance that while you might know a large portion of it, maybe you're very capable in several of the different tabs, probably there's going to be a notion among all the people that use Resolve that, at least they'll still probably call themselves colorists. And if they happen to be good at other things, then that's a bonus. But the idea, we know, if you're an audio guy, if you do sound mix, that's a gigantic lifelong endeavor, kind of like architecture or engineering or, color grading or being a great editor. There's a lifelong pursuit there. To all of a sudden just adopt, say, sound mixing or compositing, these things that you could, spend 20 years becoming really excellent at, the idea that you would then spread yourself across all these and then people would say that this is sort of a requirement, I don't think that's fair. So hopefully what will happen is even though Resolve's capable a lot, people become great at a section of Resolve that they really enjoy, and maybe they'll be capable in some other areas, but there's a thought that, you'll hang your hat on one of those tabs and the others would just be something they're also, offering.
The thing is, too, is roto is becoming more and more a thing in grading. And you get some pretty decent roto tools in Fusion.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's really neat about Fusion is when Fusion was competing for what we'll call the big major feature film work with, say, Shake and the early versions of Nuke, because Fusion's been around a long time. I think it arrived in, say, the mid-90s, I believe. It's actually a little bit older than Resolve, believe it or not. And so when Blackmagic bought Fusion, the difficult thing of being a Fusion user is there was this thought that Fusion had been in the background of some of these other applications. And then when Blackmagic bought them, there was this hope, I think, for a lot of Fusion users that Fusion would finally get the kind of support and the effort and the marketing and the thought as to what it could possibly be from a company with real resources. And so one of the things that's an interesting question is the direction that Fusion's going, I think, is kind of unexpected. The idea that it would have landed in a color corrector is really interesting. If you had told anybody, say, 5 years ago, that this was going to occur, it would have been sort of an amazing story at a minimum. But now it's certainly there. And actually, it is really complementary because I think there's a lot of tasks, just like you said, that need to happen in a final finish pass along with the color, and many things that are last minute that actually studios find extremely valuable when you're in the middle of a grade and something is spotted that has never been seen before and it needs to be gone or it needs to be fixed or it needs to be addressed. The ability to resolve that, not necessarily right there in that moment, but the ability to resolve it within the time that's remaining, which could be a couple weeks at most or maybe even less, is really powerful and compelling. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of people who specialize in that and they make extremely, well, I would say at a minimum, billable hours doing that sort of work. They basically come in and they save the day on short notice on things that are critical to accomplish before release. And, you have this tool now in Resolve that's capable of that.
There are some little changes, too, that have happened in Resolve that, like, both of us kind of noticed when we talked about, like, being able to change printer points by a quarter point or a half point, which on the surface seems like a very minimal thing, but it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, well, the thing is, so I'm a printer point guy. I happen to use printer points along with shapes and keys, in a sort of a very specific method that sort of excludes control panels, which I'm a little bit known for. But what I'll say is, I'm basically a grade with a keyboard and mouse. The guys that I work with who have taught me this method do as well, and then a number of other people that we are close to. And so the thing that's really interesting is for us, that really matters because, believe it or not, it seems like a printer point is somewhat small adjustment, but there are times as you get really good with printer points where a half a point or a quarter point are really the difference. You'll be in a situation where you'll be like adjusting, say, someone's skin tone, or there might be something that you're keying and you're trying to get into place. And there really is a correct spot where a quarter point or a half point is exactly what you need. And if you don't have that, you're sort of working around the ideal. So let's say you're too far or too under where you want, and a quarter point lands you right in that spot. So the thing that's interesting about printer points is while it's a very old tool, it's actually a really precise and consistent tool in that if I want to add a half of a point of red to someone's skin tone on a bunch of shots, I can do a very exact, repeatable adjustment with printer points. And when you have a quarter point, that's a very precise adjustment, and a lot of color tools don't necessarily have that. I mean, a number do. I use Luster. Luster has that. It's had it for a long time. But you can actually not only do full, half, and quarter printer points, but you can also adjust what you want to call a point. So the actual value that is input when you press a key. And that flexibility is a huge deal for, say, someone like me and all the guys I work with.
Not only that, but it's really dependent on the keypad itself, too, about using things in tandem in the order with the keypad.
What's really interesting is that when you're trying to do a really precise adjustment, there are lots of ways to input a color change. So you can do a knob, you could do a trackball, you can do a ring. And, what we rely on is a keypad. Essentially, hopefully you have one that has what would be 12 keys, 3 rows of 4 keys. And so essentially that gives you red, green, blue, minus red, green, blue, and then plus cyan, magenta, yellow, and then minus cyan, magenta, yellow. And then you combine that with the printer point, the ability to adjust what the actual size of a point is per key press, and then also whether it's a full, a half, or a quarter. And you have this incredibly precise way to say, take a key and go and, make an adjustment, or you could be in a shape or whatever it is you've sort of lassoed in your image. It's a really precise way to work. And so people in Resolve have the full complement, let's say, of printer point tools now. And it's just really nice.
From working in it, I did play around with the public beta recently. I just found that in general, there was a little bit more precision in all of the tools, because in the past you would be in, say, the RGB mixer and it would go from 0.97 to 1 or something like that when you would scroll through. But now I feel like a lot of that stuff is really well tuned for using with the keyboard, which was a nice surprise.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have used Resolve. Let's say that you're using the RGB sliders. And let's say, for instance, when I used to first grade with Resolve, I didn't have a control panel, and I would use, for instance, the mouse wheel, or I'd use actually the mouse cursor to make adjustments right on the RGB sliders. And there was a lot of times when you felt like the incrementation was just wide enough where you're wishing you could do half of that. And essentially, yeah, it looks like Resolve is really attacking what we'll call really fine grading with the way that the gearing in their tools works.
Also, like on a technical side of it too, for delivery, one of the big surprises was that they're going to allow IMF export, which it's kind of one of those things that's been reserved for very expensive software or hardware, and not something that's easy to do either. And for it to be in a $300 app, it's yet another thing that they're kind of shaking up.
Yeah, it's really in there with DCP creation. In the past, making a DCP was a difficult thing that required, what we'll call at least specialized software that often costs quite a bit. And I think there was sort of a DCP revolution that occurred where not only did Resolve and a number of other apps start to sort of embrace the idea that people might make DCPs on their own as opposed to going to a facility or specialist, let's say. There's a very similar situation going on with IMF. So I don't deal with IMF myself. We have a whole department that sort of dedicates their life to getting it right. But what I'll say is that IMF's a challenging format. It's supposed to be this very capable master format that a company could sort of rely on as the deliverable of deliverables, And one of the challenges is IMF can have a number of different layers. I believe it can carry many different types of audio as well as subtitling, as well as different, maybe even versions. And also, I think there's a possibility. I believe that you can derive many different kinds of deliverables from one IMF file. So with that comes a real difficult challenge in actually making an IMF file, and then also in playing back an IMF file. So I know at our building, we were dealing with a situation where we were trying to successfully, smoothly QC IMF files, and it was really challenging. And we used Clipster, and we also used Colorfront Transcoder. And the boxes that we put together in order to do IMFs were they would be an amazing color box. They were basically, I think, the large super micros with dual Xeons and a lot of RAM and between 4 and 6 large Titan X style graphics cards. And so you had this box and you're like, wow, who's getting that? And you're like, deliverables. And so you're in a situation where you're watching this thing roll by on a cart, and seriously, if you outfit a super micro that way, you're looking at like $20,000, $25,000 worth of hardware. This was literally what they were dedicating toward making IMFs. And the challenge was so hard, it deserved a box of that caliber that, largely anyone running almost any app would love to use for just creation, much less just rendering out a file. It's nice that Resolve has that now. It'd be really cool to see how well it does and if it's really successful in sort of offering that option in the way that other options for DCP arrived a few years ago.
You mentioned earlier that in the last few years, you've been doing projects in Lustre, and there was even some really interesting news about Flame this year too. Things that a lot of people weren't expecting in terms of Lustre things being built into Flame. How do you see a lot of this impacting the projects that you work on?
Well, I think we're faced with a similar situation. So we use Lustre, and actually Lustre is a very straight ahead color-only color corrector. So in terms of effect support, in terms of anything that would be considered editorial, it's very minimal. You can certainly bring files in and you can edit them in a timeline, and there's all those sorts of things, but you wouldn't ever want to cut anything of merit in Lustre in the way you can in Resolve, or say other apps like, Quantel Rio that has a really nice timeline, for instance. So the thing is that we've only been doing color correction, but we're faced with the same situations that you were bringing up before where, at the last moment we're asked to do things. And so classically there's this situation, send it to Flame. And that's a, long-standing term for save me
yeah.
in a big post house is send
Flame
it to
it
Flame.
Out.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things that they did is there was a little bit of a bi-directional effort on Autodesk part recently in the last, let's say, 3 years, where not only were they trying to make Lustre and Flame work together really well, sort of the interop being very tight, in the way you would have, say, Premiere with After Effects, that kind of handing off of files and the ability to work with each other's either renders or sequence data or whatever. But also there's a situation where tools from Flame were brought over to Lustre, and also Lustre tools were brought over to Flame. So Flame has a really wonderful editorial tool set, an incredible VFX tool set that's on par with something like Nuke or even Fusion. And then the thing that it did not have actually was a very what we'll call complete set of color tools. So in the last year or two, some of the Flame VFX tools have made it into Lustre through what they refer to as a connected color workflow. What that's referring to is this idea that you can evoke Flame VFX tools in Lustre, sort of use a version of Flame that is VFX only called Flare, take and render that down and have it as the new source material in Lustre. And now vice versa, they've actually taken some of the color tools from Lustre, sort of Lustre's color board, if you want to call it that, and they've brought it into Flame. And so one of the things that I didn't realize myself as a guy who's around that app all the time is that they would bring them so soon. So there was a number of conversations and moments where we were able to see some preliminary things regarding these color tools. And we thought they were going to come in like a year or something, maybe a little bit more. But actually, some really important ones have arrived in 2019, and it actually caught me by surprise. So a couple things that Flame now has. It has a legitimate color grading style thumbnail timeline with incredible sortability. There's basically a panel that comes up that lets you grab whatever clips you might want via a number of different kinds of metadata handles, let's say. So let's say you wanted everything from a certain reel or from a certain day or anything that was embedded in metadata. You can basically sort this, Resolve / Lustre / Nucoda style thumbnail timeline, however you like. That didn't exist before. And then just below it now, actually in a tab that's brand new with 2019 called Effects, is a full, legit color correction tool set. Now, there are some things that are missing, like, for instance, there isn't a still store yet, which is something that's really important to us. There aren't ways to, sort of ripple changes across a timeline in a way you can in, say, a Lustre or Resolve. But there is a really wonderful new color tool called Master Grade, which I'll say is kind of like a modern tool in the same way that Filmlight's Base Grade is, and it's a color space aware tool that allows you to grade in log, linear, or video space, at any one time, that also has what we'll call very complete HDR functionality. So this tool replaces what was the color warper and color corrector before, which were fine and actually won awards many years ago in terms of technical achievement, but weren't really wonderful if you were trying to use Flame to grade. And so anyway, these tools, like a legitimate timeline, the ability to have a gallery, the ability to do, grading in the way you would in a Resolve or Lustre, now exist in Flame for the first time. And so with that, while there's still some things that need to be added, it's the underpinnings of a really, really nice possibility in terms of grading.
So do you feel like, even though it doesn't have the Ripple grades option or the same still store and the options that you enjoy in Lustre, but you get all of the visual effects that you have in Flame, do you think that that's a good trade-off, or do you think people are still going to prefer to stay in just Lustre?
Well, if you've got to do a show that requires a complete tool set where you rely on still stores and things like that, this set of tools that's been put into Flame is a really wonderful addition, but it falls just short of that. So while you could actually do some really formidable grading in Flame now in a really nice way, I mean, I've actually been working with it and Resolve and some of these other apps that are offering sort of downloads now, and it's really enjoyable. Now, Flame's a daunting tool, especially if you haven't seen it before. And even I've put a bunch of hours into Flame over the last few years, and there's still, you could spend a lifetime learning sections of Flame like Batch and stuff. But what I'll say is that the color tools were fairly easy to pick up, having come from, other color correctors. So I think it's going to be an evolution. Initially, there is this first set of tools, which is wonderful and a surprise. And then in coming years, there's a possibility of other additions that will make that tool set more complete. So it's neat to see. And I think one of the things that Resolve is offering, there's a good possibility that Flame will offer as well, which is a really capable color tool set with the addition of wonderful save my life options for people who are in that circumstance. So
The other part of that, as far as Flame goes, that this also nobody was expecting, was being able to use Filmlight's BLG grades inside of Flame. So essentially what that does is it's similar to what they do with, say, editions, where you can be in Avid and you can load BLG files from a full Baselight and see all of your grades live in Avid. I don't know if it's released, but they've planned this release that, it's a plugin for Flame. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it's really cool. You know what? I learn a ton of what I know about BLGs from you. So you're basically the person that's told me, you have really involved workflow. I mean, what's really crazy is my life is a very straight ahead one in terms of, we bring in reels, we use an EDL to cut them up and we grade. You deal with an incredible, complex variety of not only multiple conforms that come in across the life of your show. And so you're having to do all sorts of things related to graphics and text and also all the legal things, like you do a lot of removals and blur outs. And, when people don't sign paperwork, apparently you have to take care of that, So BLG has been a huge benefit to you. And I think it might be a huge benefit to people who are in Flame. So essentially, what's really neat is that Baselight has the ability to navigate Wiretap Gateway and actually fetch projects from a Flame in the same way that Lustre does. So Lustre Flame Interop relies on this process called Wiretap, which is a way to pass sequence data from machine to machine and allow a very cool collaborative workflow. And my understanding is that Baselight has the ability to do that too. And now they've upped it even more with the possibility of allowing Flame to take a look directly at BLG grades. So does that make sense based on what you've done? So it's almost as if it can fetch them into the timeline, right?
Essentially, it sees all of the different elements that would be in a Baselight grade, whether they be shapes or qualifiers or any of those things. It's able to render all of those things inside of the plugin. And it does a match based on the source name and the source time code. So yeah, you could have that across your whole sequence, and each of these individual files represents each of your clips. And it's a great way to work.
How far along is it for you in terms of your ability to rely on it to accomplish all of your stuff? So I know that you've put a lot of effort into, you've been a beta tester for them, and you've actually been using BLGs for a long time, right?
Yeah, I think that when they started doing things with base grade, it became very compelling to use the software, because with one tool, you could basically do a lot of different things, which really speeds up your workflow. So say if you're trying to attack shadows or highlights or something or dark shadows versus mid shadows, you can do it all from within one tool, which is what base grade is. It's also, as you had said before, color space aware. So if you have one shot that happens to be S-Log 3, S-Gamut 3, and you have another shot that's just straight Rec 709 and another shot that happens to be GoPro, the tool works exactly the same way on all of those. So it becomes really easy to jump in between multiple different cameras and quickly. The other thing about Baselight that's great is how you can ripple grades across too. So you can multi-paste grades based on the tape name. You can multi-paste only selected layers if you want. You can go forward or backwards. So once you really get your brain around how the tool works, I think it's really exciting to use. There are things that are more appropriate for Resolve to handle, and there's other things I think that are more appropriate for Baselight to handle. But it just really depends on analyzing the job that you have and deciding which tool is best to accomplish what you're looking for.
The one thing I was wondering is there's a thought that Filmlight professes that everything in BLE or Baselight editions is largely identical to what you'd find in, say, Daylight or the full Baselight system. So they actually just released some new updates, I think, for Baselight. They have a bunch of new HDR capable tools. Like they have a thing what they call their looks operator, as well as this thing called Boost Range, which is really nice for taking SDR and upscaling it, so to speak, to HDR. And then they did same thing. They've enhanced their keyers, and they have a bunch of things related to the relight tool that allow you to now, for instance, adjust specular highlights in a really precise way. So the thing that's really cool is that all that I hear is coming in Baselight, the new version of Baselight 5. So I guess you'll probably see trickle down from all that.
Yeah, at some point, like a lot of the things come through, except for select things like paint and the warping tools and stuff like that are reserved for just full base light. The question really is, though, are we still in a world that requires big iron like full base light? That's kind of a polarizing idea, too. So the elephant in the room is the $300 version of Resolve is always the question. Does that drive the price of everything down, whether it be flame or base light or Quantel or Mystica or any of those? So that's always, it seems like we constantly are having that conversation too, year after year. But Resolve keeps adding new things in. So it makes it more difficult.
And you're dealing very directly with that. You were trying to play, what your best option would be if you wanted to do something innovative with your workflow, because you were testing daylight, I believe, and you've actually put in time with film light on baselight itself, and then you've also got a ton of time in with BLE. So I guess, are you in the middle of sort of weighing that with your tech people about what you might do?
Yeah, we're still trying to figure out which one is best. And there's certain shows that I work on that are already done in Resolve, so they make sense to continue to do them with that. But yeah, we're always exploring new options and, new software and whatever is right for the job we use. But, Filmlight has done like a ton of really big movies. The biggest one that we've heard about was Black Panther, Isle of Dogs, and Black Mirror. And there's been a ton that they've really stepped out and done. So it really feels like they're starting to gain more high profile shows, and a lot of people are still interested in using it, and it's a great tool. So I don't see why they shouldn't. Where do you think that really fits in the whole scheme? Like, is it going to be big features, or do you think it's going to be commercials, or where do you think the best place for Baselight ultimately is going to be?
Well, I guess the one thing that you would take a look at is, if you were to divide up the world, where would you make a differentiation between one large group that might say use one tool versus another? And so, the nice thing about Filmlight, and I'll also say this about others like Luster, Flame, Digital Vision with Nucoda and Phoenix, Mystica from SGO, they have a version of some sort, at least, of what they'll call a premium pricing model. And so there's this thought that they're like, look, our attempt is to give you what we believe are exceptional tools that will merit the money that you're spending. Totally. Blackmagic has done a lot of really amazing things for the industry. They have empowered a lot of people. They have allowed certain companies that now have entire business models based around the thought that Blackmagic exists and provides them with the infrastructure they need to run a profitable company in an era where price is constantly being questioned. But then within that is also a world where people are, while price is always an important factor for, I think, any kind of business. If you're making money, you have to be understanding where your expenses are. But what I would say is that there's a number of people, while price is important, there are other things that are important. And so I think the film lights and the digital visions and the Autodesks of the world are there to satisfy those people that might have price as a consideration, but some other really important things in terms of, let's say, functionality regarding how they attack a gigantic feature that has 26 VFX vendors and many millions of dollars in budget. So when you're in that situation, and absolutely very thin budgets are not quite the issue, it's more of a performance problem. You're in a situation where you have to tackle a really formidable show on a deadline, and there's a situation where failure to deliver could cost many millions of dollars that are much more consequential than whether or not your color corrector costs $300 or $20,000. And so when you're taking a look at like failing to mail or uplink via satellite your DCPs to your 4,700 theaters for your Star Wars release, right? The color corrector cost doesn't weigh anywhere in that at all. So there are people that are faced with the perfect execution, if that could be possible, of these really large scale movies. And there's definitely a market for a tool that is more expensive and offers solutions for those sorts of customers' pain points. So when you're an owner operator, which I was just even a few years ago, a big pain point for me was cost, and Resolve was an amazing option. I went and I happily paid for my Resolve dongle, feeling like many people that I was empowered to now take over the universe, which I have done like maybe 50%, got the other 50 left. So, we're all, busy, about to take over our town, right, with our amazingness. So Resolve allowed a lot of people to do that. before, there were really no good options that were really complete. So, while many people put a lot of time into Apple Color or even Final Cut or Avid Symphony, there was a situation where those weren't thoroughbred color correctors quite like Resolve was. And so that was an amazing deal for us. There are people that are out there that are tackling a similar sort of situation where they have to do visually the most spectacular movies ever made. You've got stuff like Black Panther coming out, Ready Player One. You have things that are beholden to the greatest franchises ever, like Star Wars, And so you're sitting there and you've got, the most important movies in, let's say, cinema have to be executed in a way that not only fans will like, but that also, are possible within the bounds of the limitless ideas that these people are coming up with. When that's your pain point, you're in a situation where some of the things that these other tools offer are incredibly critical. We could go on and on about what those are, but the thought is that that's why they're being bought.
In the past, NABs, there's been a big push for color managed workflows like ACES, and it was really a big thing that everyone was talking about, and it's kind of waned a little bit. Like, I haven't heard anything about it recently at this NAB. Maybe I'm not hearing it from the right places, but I haven't heard much about it, and I'm not sure if the adoption is still catching on, or maybe people are still using old workflows for this stuff too. But is it still possible, you think, to have one unified color managed workflow that, is a standard that everybody can work with?
The challenge with that is that I think everybody is dealing with different circumstances. We actually have started having discussions, among the guys I work with about, is it possible for us all to do the same thing? And the thing that's really wild is that, 4 minutes into that conversation, it's like, oh, no way, I'm not doing that. So what's going on is that everybody has the things, not only that they hold dear in terms of their philosophy about, how they work. So for instance, we traditionally in the past worked with a log workflow where it was log DPX, and we had a show LUT that would include the camera transform and some creative adjustments in order to get the show into a good starting point. But then what happened and sort of blew all that up was the idea that clients want to start using EXR. They want to start working at 4K. There's a situation where in a huge way, very recently, a lot of the effort of VFX houses to sort of unify what they're doing. Let's say that you have 20 VFX vendors on a very big show, right? Those VFX vendors are working together in a collaborative way that they've all decided on. And then you're the post house and they're like, hey, get over here. Where are you going, right? So they're basically like, take what we're doing as a VFX house and now adopt this as a post house. They are largely, looking at their issues in terms of what they have to accomplish, and they're handing it off to us without necessarily assuming that it will be a positive or a negative, but they're basically saying, if you could get on board, then you could be unified with us too. And so I think one of the things that's interesting is that when you're an owner operator or a smaller shop, it's really neat. You get to determine your own destiny. As soon as you get into shows that have multiple vendors, whether that's a post house, along with all the things going on in dailies, plus a VFX shop or 2 or 10 or 20, then all of a sudden there's a situation where you can't do exactly what you want. And so I think a lot of it's based on this idea that if we have so many people working on a show, which, for a really large VFX movie, it could be between 500 and 1,000 people just in VFX, that they'll hire in order to get these shows done. There's a situation where to make all of those people have work that is fruitful and actually delivers in the way that's expected, because everybody in grading has gotten shots from VFX where they've gone and said, what in the heck? Why is the VFX house sending me stuff that's either washed out or crushed or blown out or solarized or whatever? Well, that was a mistake possibly from a color workflow or a color pipeline. And there's a desire to try to solve that stuff so it doesn't happen. I mean, VFX houses, don't get up in the morning and say, how can I screw up a DI today? Right. They're trying really hard to figure out what they can do. And so I think if anything, it's just a hope that as the scale of the shows gets very large, that there is a good way to sort of unify under one hat. And ACES is sort of the best hat that people have come up with. However, everybody seems to want to modify their hats, right? So you've run into that. I mean, you've basically been in a situation where you're trying to figure out workflows for your shows because you had sort of if I'm correct, you had like a Rec 709 style work, like traditional broadcast, and you've actually moved into log yourself. How has that worked for you?
It works great. I always like to say for the documentary style stuff that I do that's shot in log, it at least gives you a fighting chance with the footage. Because of the nature of these shows, sometimes something happens and it's more important to get the shot than to either get the focus right or to get the exposure correct. So at least when it's in that format, I can make some of those decisions later a little bit easier. But when I'm stuck with something that's just Rec 709, you're kind of stuck at a certain point. But yeah, I think that it's getting everybody kind of used to the workflow too, because in the offline, they may say, why does this shot look flat? Or maybe it doesn't look right. It looks overexposed when I apply a LUT to it. But maybe the DP intended that so that it, you could actually bring it down in post. But I personally like working that way. I think it's a little bit more freeing to make some decisions here and there. So yeah, I hope to see more of that in the future.
Do you think there's a chance that you guys might actually adopt ACEs for your shows, or has there been any conversation about it?
Probably would stick with something more like Resolve Color Management or with TrueLight from Filmlight, because those seem to work a little bit better in our situations. And I haven't had a lot of luck with ACEs myself, but I'm not completely ruling it out either. It just is one of those things where based on the time that I have to work on it, that it may or may not work. And it seems like TrueLight and Resolve Color Management have been easy for me to implement in my workflows.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one of the things that's kind of notable is to take a look at the companies that have, supported ACEs. You've got a bunch of companies like Filmlight is famous for their color science. Autodesk has a huge, actually, color science team that works on all the things that we do in Luster and Flame, sort of developing that pipeline. And I would say that Luster doesn't have a lot of really interesting operator-facing bullet points in the way that, say, a Resolve does. But one thing it does have is incredible color science under the hood that is being rapidly developed right now because of the fact that we're facing these larger shows and stuff like that. Another company that's really a huge ACES proponent is Digital Vision. Both Nucoda and Phoenix are fully ACES compliant. And actually, it's a little difficult. They have to actually code ACES from scratch because those boxes work on Windows. And so I believe the Academy offers a Linux and a OS X version of the ACES SDK. This is sort of possibly right at the brink of my knowledge, but Digital Vision works really hard in order to offer ACES support and the color science too. They have a thing called CMS, Color Management System, that is sort of like a TrueLight. And so one of the things that they've done, a big deal with like, say, Nucoda and Phoenix 2018, which came out at NAB, is they've got new color science and GPU-based improvements that they've added that allow them to sort of take some of these really huge color spaces and process them really efficiently in the same way a Resolve does. So they have that combined with a really intelligent caching system that has allowed them to take some of these gigantic, what we'll call monster EXR-based, we'll say color spaces that would also often be associated with EXR or a VFX workflow and handle that really elegantly. For instance, a big customer of theirs is Pixar. When you take a look at like a Toy Story or Cars, or I think Incredibles 2 is coming out, which would be amazing. So the thought is that, Nucoda 2018 has a lot of those same improvements as well. Plus, Nucoda now has Nucoda Academy, which is really cool. So I guess if you were interested in Nucoda, there's a possibility of actually learning Nucoda, and it's the real deal. It's a full-featured version. So you can actually sort of test that color science out, see if it benefits your workflow, and then if you enjoy that as well as what Nucoda does. Plus, they have the DVO tools, Digital Vision opticals for people who don't know what that means, but they have actually a very cool package of 4 plugins, Clarity, Sharpen, Regrain, and Chroma, which we use all the time actually on our shows. What they do is they basically are either, image enhancement or image fixing. So, for instance, Clarity, Sharpen, and Regrain, we use those quite a bit in order to take what we'll call footage that might need some help. Let's say it's either slightly out of focus, or there's a situation where the exposure wasn't right, or there's grain based on low light situation, and it'll clean all of that up. And so that's going to be actually available as what they call DVO access in Flame, as well as later on in the coming months, other platforms. So they haven't announced it, but, when you're talking about all those things and then combine that with color management, you have a situation where in the past, it was just sort of your render out and your LUT, And so now there's a situation where, frankly, we're already sort of doing VFX with the fact that a lot of times we're saving stuff that might have needed help in terms of just basic exposure or problems with grain, and then you've got these things now where you're dealing with Resolve 15 as Fusion, Flame, and Luster have this sort of cross integration that's going on. And then also, like you were saying, with Filmlight, they have the paint tools and really interesting tracking, like what we'll call planar tracking, that allows them to attach a paint fix to a surface in a photorealistic way, So you combine all that combined with, all the color science stuff and the fact that now everything is going to move toward 4K EXR, and we all have to just quit and go to school so we can learn all this stuff. I don't know. Did you also hear about all the control panel stuff Tangent came out with recently?
The really big Tangent.
Yeah, it's called the ARC, sort of to go along with the Tangent nomenclature. But yeah, they came out with a new full-size panel, what you could call a Premiere grading panel that's 3 separate sections. There's a center trackball panel, there is a sort of a functions panel, and maybe a transport panel. So they basically came out with that. I think that's going to be available, that was originally available for Luster, and now it's also going to be available for Nucoda and Mystica. And then they also came out with the Wave, which you and I both started on, the Wave V2, right? Yeah. Remember?
Yeah,
I remember your famous sentence all about the double punch.
That's right.
So we can...
Double punch of the arrows.
Yeah, so basically Wave V2 came out, which looks really cool. That's supported almost in everything. I think the Wave would be almost across almost any tool that you can work with in grading. So it had wide support for the original. And I think the new one will too. And then the other thing that's really cool, kind of an unloved area that Tangent's attacking right now, editorial. So Final Cut 10, they've got a new utility, I think, called Command Post, which will allow you to use Final Cut 10 with Tangent, Element, or Wave Panel, as well as Premiere. There's like a plugin now, I believe. I haven't used it myself, but apparently you can map a Tangent panel to a ton of controls in Premiere. And then I think Nuke and Nuke Studio, Nuke X, there are some really interesting color options that even, people have either custom created or that come with Nuke. They actually have a node called Color Grade, which is pretty famous. And so you'll be able to actually go in and, imagine that. You'll be in like a program like Nuke controlling with a panel, right? And those guys, thought all they could ever look forward to was a Wacom, So Tangent came out with a bunch of stuff. And then monitors. Did you hear anything about monitors? There's a bunch of announcements monitor-wise.
Yeah, there was a bunch of stuff from FSI, right?
Right. They have 2 really important new monitors they came out with. So they've had a lot of really cool options in the past that were very high performance at a reasonable price. So they've come out with a new one called the XM310K. And so that's their sort of preeminent HDR monitor. That's going to be their new master reference monitor. They said at the show, I actually was able to chat a little bit with Brahm, who runs FSI. The thing that's actually really cool is that FSI is really famous for their back end. And so one of the things they do is they offer these really nice, complete calibration capable backends that not only offer you all the features in terms of how you use the monitor and the inputs, but also what you do with the monitor in terms of processing those inputs. So, LUT support to calibrate the monitor. Some of them actually, like I know some of their DM series monitors can actually offer real-time grading options where you literally, can control it like there are boxes that DITs would use. And this is actually the color backend on a certain FSI, I think DM models is capable of being that box, and allowing you live color adjustment for a DP on set. And so they came out with the XM310 as their new, 31-inch master monitor. And they also came out with a 65-inch reference monitor, like a legit real one, not like one that you buy at Best Buy. And so, using panels, I believe, from LG, but with their really amazing back end, they came out with, I think it's called the XM650, and that's their 65-inch reference monitor that also really capable. I think it'll do like 1,000 nits peak, depending on, how you're working. And then it also has a really amazing back end. I think it's something like a 12-bit 1D LUT, and then I think it also has support for up to 33-point cube LUTs, so you would be able to, not only calibrate the monitor, but if you had like a look LUT, and you wanted the monitor to present either the look LUT or the transform that you were using on set that you would eventually use in the DI. You could actually load that into the monitor and it would present your image to you, so you could expose around that. And then I think they're doing like some crazy stuff like 12G SDI and quad SDI so that you can handle 4K because both those monitors are 4K capable. So one of my biggest sadnesses is that I love monitors dearly. I'm a big fan of like what Panasonic and LG have come out with, and I wasn't able to go to NAB this year, and I would love to see what what Flanders, had come out with. So those two monitors are their big sort of introductions for this year. And it'll be very cool because, really there was just the Sony, the BVMX300, which was, sort of the preeminent small master monitor for HDR grading. So now there's finally an option from FSI. Sony came out with, I think, new firmware in the BVM V2. So that's very cool. And then they came out, I think, it's interesting. They had I remember one year we were looking at their larger, I think it was the 50-inch or 55-inch ref monitor. They're sort of like large client monitor. And so, the PVM X550, which is their 4K OLED, I think that's officially out now. I haven't seen one since about 2 NABs ago.
They're they're dubbing that as the client monitor for your X300.
Right, yeah. And so hopefully, and actually when I think we all went and looked at them together about 2 years ago, I think that's what happened. And I remember they were extremely close. I mean, one of the things that Sony did is they line up their entire, array of monitors, and they're, quite close. So, and then beyond that, Azo is now also, they've got their HDR options. They came out with a monitor called the CG319. And so that's a follow-up to the 318, which I love dearly. So if you ever get a chance to use a 318, that's a very amazing 30-inch Azo computer monitor that you'll just sort of stare at. It's like if we could still do iTunes Visualizer and that monitor, you have an evening full of just quiet fun.
So like HDR has kind of dominated a lot of the conversation at NAB now. So like it used to be stereo and 4K, but now it's a lot of like HDR and VR too is the other thing that people are pushing. These days, there's a ton of HDR adoption. I mean, if you're talking about Netflix with Stranger Things or House of Cards or any of the shows that happen to be on Netflix, like there's more and more content that's available now. So how do you think that HDR is going to really change things in the future, whether it's in the home or Dolby Cinema or something like that?
Well, I mean, one of the things that's really tough is, finding what you would consider really good, legitimate HDR. And what I mean by that is something that fulfills the promise of HDR in a way that is not only dazzling, but also respects the original content. So I think there is a little bit of a challenge with that in terms of there's a lot of different opinions about the way HDR should work. So a lot of people look at HDR as being something where if you were to be, mastering an HDR, either a show, a TV, film, that you would literally want all your specular highlights to be, at 1000 and you'd want all of your blacks to be at 0, let's say. And so the thought would be is that you want to sort of make use of the entire range of that display's illuminance. The thing that's really challenging is if you just do that arbitrarily, you can have a really garish result. And there's a lot of tools out there that attempt to help people get to that place where you are using HDR and at the same time not making your show look way worse, or even worse, like very painful, which is what can happen if you sort of just, boost everything. But the other thing too is that you have the creative intent of the DP. And a thing that's kind of amazing about HDR is that because of the fact that it has this incredible latitude, you now have lots of room for detail in your highlights. And at the same time, you have lots of detail available for your shadows. So if things were supposed to be filled in, let's say in a dark night scene, there's a situation where HDR might reveal what was underneath the car or behind the dumpster, And the thing that's really interesting is a lot of DPs are like, I don't want you to see behind my dumpster.
Yeah. That's where all the cables live.
I know. That's where like that guy who got caught on set is hiding out. So anyway, the thing that's really interesting is that, you have the opinions of DPs as the authors of the image. You have what your mastering colorists are looking at in terms of attempting to make use of HDR in the most fruitful way possible. Then you have colorists who are coming into this situation where maybe others with prior experience are expressing their values. And then as you start to look at HDR, you rapidly start to form your own values. So I think one of the things that's really important is for HDR to be successful is hopefully people have a good first impression of it. Because I know a lot of people who've seen what we'll call underwhelming HDR or HDR that was, let's say, borderline offensive and found that they were turned off to it indefinitely. They made a judgment based on that. And that's a shame because HDR is an honest, qualitative attempt to improve the image. And that doesn't come along too often. There's things like resolution, which is great, but that's really a technical thing. 4K is 4K. There's no creative insight required for 4K film to be then displayed in a 4K projector and to be worked on in 4K. It's a spec. It's a single parameter. When you're dealing with HDR, you're not only dealing with the technical side, but you're dealing with the creative application of that, which requires taste. So I think one of the things that's really going to be interesting over these next, let's say, couple years is A, can we all get on board for what good HDR is supposed to be? And can the displays that we're supposed to be looking at HDR on offer that to us in all the places that we want to view? So for instance, a lot of people are staying at home now in order to watch things. So can the TV sets that have been offered recently, give people the HDR experience they want on, say, home Blu-ray? And then there's the really nice experience, probably the preeminent way, I think, to see HDR is on a Dolby Vision projector called the Eclipse projector, which is not a thing that's in every single city, but most major cities at least have 1 or 2 Dolby Vision theaters. And you also combine that with Atmos, which is a fantastic, dazzling way to hear a film. And you have a really amazing new way to enjoy a movie, So the thing is that I think the theatrical side is somewhat ironed out, other than the philosophical things that various post houses or DPs or colorists will do in terms of how they feel HDR should look. But the thing that's going to be really important is because so many people are at home, there's going to be a need to really suss out all these varying light levels, the way that we see HDR on TVs that could be everything from a very nice, like $4,000 or $5,000 TV, all the way down to like the $1,000 Best Buy doorbuster, right? People are going to buy that. They're going to say, hey, it says HDR. That's all I need to know. It was $1,000. I really don't care about what hybrid log gamma is, but I'm going to go home and watch me a Blu-ray disc, right? So you got to hope that this guy with his $1,000 TV has a good experience. I'd be like, why did I just buy a new TV? I didn't use the 3D and now I'm not going to use the HDR. So, that's the big thing that I feel like is hopefully everyone having their way with HDR for a moment, and then us all coming to our senses in a way that makes it productive and enjoyable for the broad spectrum of ways that we, watch content, So I love HDR. I've been able to see really good HDR. I hope HDR is here to stay. And I think one of the big things will just be whether or not, people can go and see really good versions of it. And if you're a colorist, hopefully you can start grading some HDR soon, because that's the most enlightening thing that you could possibly do if you want to understand HDR. Watching HDR doesn't do anything for you in terms of really understanding how HDR comes to be. You can certainly make judgments and take a look at a really great Blu-ray and say, hey, this is cool HDR or this is not. But the minute you start grading it in 5 minutes, you will learn more than in watching 20 movies. It's really cool. A challenge with HDR is its comparison to SDR. So one of the things that you run into is this need to sustain both of them. I think maybe it was similar to digital versus analog broadcast. For some number of years, we had to make sure both were fine. Maybe SD, right? When we were doing standard def, and you dealt with that, very completely. You're an expert at that. So SD, and then, the way the HD transition occurred. I'm hoping that the transition time isn't too long and that the TVs just become capable enough to do what we'll call these light levels in a comfortable way that's affordable and that, offers people a way to just sort of see HDR, and then this concept of SDR will, just become an old variant,
I think we could probably talk about all of this for probably another 2 or 3 hours, but I'm sure most people's commute is just about over by now. So
totally. Mine would be.
So there you go. But this has been really great to have you back on, Jason. It's always a fun conversation with you. If somebody wants to hear more about what you have to say on this podcast or your thoughts in general, would they go to Lift Gamma Gain, or what's the best place to see you?
Yeah, I would say the thing that's really fun, I'm on Lift Gamma Gain every single day. So if you haven't been there, it's a site completely dedicated to exactly what we're talking about. So yeah, I'm Jason Myres. I'm on the forum all the time, and we have a lot of other people. So I think one of the big things that's really fun to talk about is exactly this stuff. We have really good philosophical debates about HDR and a bunch of other things, on Lift Gamma Gain, like the merits of different color correctors and stuff. So yeah, that's the best place by far. And if you ask a question, I will likely jump in. So prepare yourself.
Cool. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. It was great.